Hello,
Okay,
world.
hello. Welcome to, I believe, our fourth installment of All People's Health Collective podcast. Maybe one day it'll have a clever name. For now, it's All People's Health Collective, talking to each other about the issues that brought us together.
Yeah.
So I'm very, very happy to be joined by one of our OG stalwart members, Catherine Wolf. We
Oh,
just call Katie. So I'll let you introduce, however that goes, and however you wish to be addressed. So can you just quickly tell us about yourself, and then we're going to jump into a conversation that you've been helping us lead that I'm very excited to have with you.
sure. So I'm a doctoral student, I guess. I don't know where to start. I'm a doctoral student at Berkeley. So I'm in two labs. I'm in both the sustainability and health equity lab and in the disabled ecologies lab. So I'm interested in the intersections of environmental health, and disability, particularly psychosocial disability, um, and also just getting disabled people out of cages. I think I'm drawn to this work in part like through my own disabilities, and through my own experiences with the medical system, through my own experiences with psychiatric hospitalization. Um, I think I'm also just motivated um, by this like kind of theory of change where the people at the bottom of a system have the clearest perspective on a system, right? And I think particularly in the space of psychosocial disability, so often a lot of policymakers make policy without consulting a single person with the relevant disability, um, due to certain forms of discrimination that I think are a little bit specific to psychosocial disability, um, which I think Miranda Fricker would call an epistemic injustice, where people assume that a psychosocial disability makes you an unreliable narrator of your own experience, and therefore policymakers don't have to consult anyone with that disability before making policy about people with those disabilities. So I think that particular dynamic just fills me with rage and has drawn me to this work. So Lex, you're muted.
Yep, I'm back. I'm back. Um, it leading you and filling you with rage, to me, is the only sensible road for you to take. So I'm glad you're here. We found each other on the path of rage. And you've been helping us understand a multitude of bills that come from Sacramento that impact what
Yeah.
is in some ways the origin story kind of germ of All People's Health Collective.
Yeah.
When we saw the merging of different forms of state violence via taking the mass criminalization that we've all kind of witnessed through the carceral system, and then seeing a system of the mass pathologizing of people through the healthcare system, especially kind of the mental health side of the healthcare system, which has always been extremely problematic and has always been extremely harmful, has always been eugenicist, and
Yeah.
frankly has always been somewhat carceral, or maybe very carceral, depending on how you want to look at it. What it's not been is carceral in the same way the criminal justice system has been, because it's not been run through the court system until now. So now they're starting to do that, and it's been accompanied by a deluge of bills in Sacramento. And although this is California centric in the beginning, we know that it's not. This is an incubation happening in California, as it often does, which will be spread throughout the country and already is in many cases. Pennsylvania has similar bills, Illinois has similar bills. I would imagine probably every state has something that looks like this. So, one thing that is important to name is that California throws more bills up against the wall than the entire
Yeah.
United States.
It's a flood every session. It's a flood.
It's a flood every session, and
Last 5 years at least.
I think it dwarfs the amount of bills that get put forth at even the federal level,
Yeah.
right? It's probably not even close. So that's one thing we need to address, which is that they consistently put forth policy, sign it into law, and then we don't always know what happens next. That exists at the federal level too. And then, two, many of these bills are very redundant, coming from competing forces. And it creates this kind of legislative horse trading that happens in the Capitol, which again happens everywhere, but is almost more openly corrupt in California than folks can imagine.
Yeah.
So there's one other point I want to make before we do this rundown, which is that all of these bills start from the lens of incrementalism. And incrementalism is where every catastrophic policy that we've ever reflected on as organizers, as activists, as policy analysts, as academics, every catastrophic bill that's ever been reflected on started incremental. And I want to just say quickly, the 1994 crime bill started as an incrementalist bill about gun control, about protecting domestic violence survivors, turned into the largest signed off project of mass incarceration in the history of humanity. The 96 immigration bill, signed by Bill Clinton, is the bill that legalized much of what we're seeing the Trump administration do today, especially when it comes to kind of a lack of due process, deporting people who already have citizenship, etc. All of these bills started incremental when they said, no, this is just for the most extreme cases, or this is just to kind of move the ball in a certain direction. And they end up being the kind of infrastructure that then later is tapped into for the most extreme policies, or they themselves become the most extreme policies. So that framing feels very important to me, because when we fight against incrementalism, because it's not actually incrementalism, that's a myth, we're often criticized for being purists, when in fact, we're helping stave off disaster. So we have many bills that are happening in California. I think for the sake of time today, we're only going to go into a couple, but give us a rundown of all of them. And then we'll start, I think, on a couple ones that have immediate implications, especially the Stearns bill, for example. And then we'll see how far we get in this combo, and we'll probably end up doing a part 2 and maybe even a part 3. And we can do as many parts as we want, because this is our podcast. So I'll pass it over to you, and excited to learn more.
Sure. Oh, I've been taking notes while you've been talking, because I have so many thoughts. One note I would just make here, particularly on the incrementalism piece, is that like the United Nations has come out on a lot of this stuff. There's a lot of international standards on mental health policy, psychosocial disability, that the United States just ignores, just completely ignores. And I'm not saying like United Nations or the World Health Organizations are perfect organizations, but I think, for example, on the incrementalism issue, like the United Nations has explicitly said you cannot make policy on psychosocial disability based on the extreme cases, like because that leads to because then inevitably systems will then apply the rules that were supposed to only apply to the most extreme cases to cases that aren't the most extreme, which leads to the erosion of civil liberties, right? And so like I just really resonated with that when you said it, and I think about that a lot, how California legislature, for example, takes terms that mean something in like international human rights or in United Nations publications or World Health Organization publications, and then uses them to mean what they don't mean in this really Orwellian way. And so anyway,
Well,
I don't
that's
know if intro to these bills. Like care court, like what is care, right? Anyway.
that's I mean, that's essential to our analysis. And I think that it's one of the most frustrating parts of trying to make the world a better place, is that demands rooted in the most important fundamental goals of human rights, human dignity, things that when achieved create a very prosperous and safe environment for us and the generations coming after us. The demands rooted in those goals get co-opted and the terms get rendered meaningless.
Yeah.
And a lot of people are guilty of this, but you're right to say that, as far as who's the most prolific when it comes to this offense, California state legislature is certainly high on that list, where they take demands, render them platitudes, or like you said, in a very Orwellian way, they start to mean the opposite. And it reminds me of, when George W. Bush was president, they had things like the Clean Air Act and stuff like that. But this is particularly troubling right now, where we saw a decade of a lot of these demands becoming popular. And we see the reality being that when people have a chance to vote for these demands, they do vote for them until those demands stop meaning things to people. And you mentioned care court. Care court came after years of work where people were saying, hey, let's replace systems of punishment with systems of care. Let's call things care first this and care first that. And I certainly worked on many campaigns that used that language. And then one day we get care court, which could not be more of an oxymoron. Care and court, it's like saying jumbo shrimp. I digress. So,
Right, exactly.
that being the case, I think that's a really good preface that you say, hey, they use these words stop meaning things, and then we lose our power. And we lose our power because we negotiate with them rather than fighting them, frankly. And
Right.
that leads us into, I think, you organically saying, hey, this is the words they're using around these bills. And so I'll pass it back to you.
Yeah. So I think a lot about like power and the state, and I think about like politicians trying to reconcile kind of competing demands, right? So like there's a lot of public opinion and a lot of politicians like frankly want to see unhoused people disappeared, right? And there's a lot of public support for disappearing unhoused people without much concern for where they go. Then there are families who like often, and not always, and I don't want to like paint all families on the same brush, and I don't necessarily know like everything about this piece, but like a lot of families like want actual care for their relatives, right? They want housing, they want, their relatives to get better. And maybe they want some control over that, right? Maybe they want to force meds. But I think whereas like the state, like there's a lot of public support for disappearing people, and there's not a lot of public support for spending a lot of money to do it, right? And so those are at odds. And so I think that's part of what leads to these bills and laws that they don't want to spend a lot of money on a really marginalized population, but they need to have the appearance like they're actually doing something humane. And so we get care court, for example. Like they want to say they're caring, but they didn't put a housing guarantee in care court, right? Which is step one. So I think, anyway, I think about that a lot.
And that's such an important note, just quickly, because it's true that people want to see, when people see what appears to be visible suffering on the street, invisible poverty, to say they want to see it disappeared can sound like an indictment of their character. Oh, you want it disappeared because you want those people disappeared and you don't care what happens to them. When the reality is people want the unhoused to be housed. It's very easy to be cynical when we know that the majority of people want to see folks living high quality, dignified lives and want there to be housing. What they're told often is that it's impossible for them to get housing, which is a lie that we've covered a little bit in some of our last podcasts with John Rafling. But that is a really important note, that when offered alternatives by the state, the alternatives don't include the answers. So I'll pass it back to you.
Yeah. I know, agreed. And I think there's also this public misunderstanding. So if you look at like public policy institute polling, when you ask the public, like what is the main cause of, being without housing, the most common answer is substance use, right? The public assumes that the answer is substance use. That's not the real answer, right? They're wrong, right? And so there's this gap in public education, I think, that like is one thing to fix. And like so I think like, yeah, I don't want to demean the public and demean what the public wants in any way. But I think that myth allows a lot of these violent, like kind of paves a path for the state to enact some of these violent policies. So anyway, let's see. So anyway, the bills that have been proposed this session. So I think one of them is Senate Bill 823 by Stern. So it adds bipolar 1 to the list
just
of
quickly,
eligible.
so 823 by Stern. Is that Ben Stearns?
Let me see. Senator Stern. I don't remember his first name, embarrassingly. I should. Let me look at the analysis and see. He's been on a couple of the mental health bills. What is your first name, friend?
Henry Stern.
Henry Stern. Yeah. So anyway, so he's running this bill. it adds bipolar 1 to the eligible diagnoses for care court. So right now the eligible diagnoses are schizophrenia spectrum and other psychotic disorders, right? And so one of the issues with that, in addition to the issue of just using a diagnosis as a reason to be eligible for a certain coercive court proceeding, right? Which is just direct disability discrimination, right? If you have this disability, we can subject you to this court proceeding for which other people aren't eligible, right? Which Disability Rights California pointed out in their initial lawsuit against Care Court a few years ago. Adding bipolar 1 expands the eligible population by multiple times over. It depends on how you calculate like who would count, right? So a lot of the studies I've seen don't differentiate between bipolar 1 and bipolar 2. And so I think Disability Rights California was arguing that it actually increases the population eligible by 10 times. I don't think all those people have bipolar 1 on their record. So you'd have to like look at it for a specific study looking at the prevalence of bipolar 1, but it definitely increases the eligible population by multiple times. So it's this huge expansion of care court. And I think that also speaks to like the incrementalism piece where like they got care court in the door by limiting the population very severely. So most people think, oh, that's not me, right? Like I'm never going to be eligible for this. But like a lot more people have bipolar 1 on their records than have schizophrenia spectrum or other psychotic disorders that aren't bipolar on their records. So that's a bill that's making its way through the legislature right now.
How
And it
far
hasn't gotten a
along?
lot of news coverage at all.
How far along in the legislature is it? Legislature.
So that's a great question. Let me look it up just.
While you look,
Yeah.
fun trivia fact about Henry Stern. His father is the actor Daniel Stern from Home Alone and City Slickers and many of everybody's favorite childhood movies. Rookie of the Year. I could go on. Anyway, fun fact.
Excellent. So it made it through Committee on Health. So it was heard on April 9th in the Committee on Health. It was referred to the Committee on Appropriations. So I think it's coming from information I got from Peers Advocating for Rights and Recovery, which is a group loosely affiliated with Disability Rights California, where I get some information about these bills from folks working on them. I don't think they know whether or not it's going to make it through appropriations because expanding the eligible population will expand the costs of care court, which is so that might be one way it dies. So it's about halfway, I'd say, through the legislative process at the moment. Because then after Senate, it has to go to Assembly and Assembly Health and then to the governor.
So this brings up a couple of really important contradictions that people, you say it hasn't gotten a lot of coverage, and I think it's a good time to remind people that part of why it's not getting a lot of coverage is because even the people pushing it know that they've not infrastructured any of these policies at all. And so what started out as this grand promise from the governor's office and the state legislature saying, we are going to disappear people off the street. But good liberals that you are, you don't want to vote for people getting put in prison. You don't want to vote for, policing, or at least we don't trust that you do. And so we'll find a way to make you guys feel good about forcefully disappearing people the same way, because California, well, like everywhere, California is demographically progressive. The vast majority of the country, if folks got to do one person, one vote, would vote for very progressive policies. Let's be clear. But California also has a very deep and strong presence and legacy of NIMBYism and a deeply colonial relationship with property and space that exists everywhere, but I don't think people quite understand how strong it is in California and how monetized it is, or how funded, I should say, how moneyed it is. And so they're banking on that kind of, especially post-gentrification California, where most parts of Los Angeles, most parts of the Bay Area are so expensive that only the generationally wealthy can live in them. They now want to have full control over every inch of sidewalk. But they don't necessarily want to feel like they're being conservatives about it. That's its own tension that needs to be unpacked, and we can talk about that. But it ends up manifesting in like, give us swift policies that'll get rid of these people, And this was the governor's office and the legislature's solution, saying, okay, we'll get rid of them, but you can feel good about it. And we'll call it Care Court. But as the old saying goes, you know, a funny thing happened on the way to the bank. And in this case, several funny things happened. And they simply do not have the resources, nor the competence, nor the cohesiveness and governance to implement something at the scale that this promised, which begs one question of what were they thinking, but also begs several other questions of, you know, how are resources used? Because what's beneath all of this when there is money to actually provide housing to people? Instead, you're creating these kind of potentially bureaucratic quagmires. But then, as we always say, it's not even bureaucracy anymore. It's just procurement and contracting. So that said, tell us a little bit about why is there no there? And just to be clear, Katie led a lot of the work. You, Katie, led a lot of the work when we were fighting against Prop 1, because with Prop 1, they wanted to infrastructure this. We almost defeated them thanks to your leadership. It ended up passing. That's its own long story because it could have been defeated. Many orgs sold the community out on that one. Many legislators sold their community out on that one. And they promised to fund it. So in theory, they got everything they wanted, and yet they still can't do it. And then I also want to put a pin in, and we'll get to this after you answer this. I want to put a pin in a conversation about bipolar itself and how we're really veering into such absurdity when you start incorporating diagnoses like bipolar into policies like this. We can get there in a minute. So tell us, Katie, why has there been no there when they had this big grandiose plan?
So one thing I've been really struck by with Care Court is how, like, where the money goes, as you were pointing out, like, where does the money go, right? And I think there's this bias in the legislature and against just giving money directly to people, right? And there have been studies, right? If you just give people without housing money, they spend it on food and housing, and it makes a huge difference, right? There was a big study, the California statewide study of people experiencing homelessness, done by, I believe, UCSF, right? And it found that, like, what most people needed was cash, right, to solve their housing problems, right? But there's this huge bias among legislators, among a bunch of other folks about just giving money directly to the people who most need it, right? So Care Court very efficiently funds people of the professional class, right? Judges, lawyers, hearing officers, right? It funnels, right? It funnels money to people, frankly, like with like advanced degrees, right? And like, quote unquote, the deserving, right? And so I think that's one of the reasons it doesn't work all that well, is it's this big waste of money toward people who don't really need it. You have enough access to other sources of money. And it like so little goes to the actual disabled person, right? Care Court did not come with a housing guarantee at all,
You
right?
mean
And
to
so
tell me that the money's not trickling down?
trickling down is not working. I think
Wow.
about that all the time, right? We were testifying on another bill. This is a little bit tangential, but I was struck by this because, like, we were testifying against one of the leaders of the UCLA Neuropsychiatric Institute, the Resnick Institute, and, like, you know, University of California salaries are public, and so I looked it up, and he earns over $500,000 a year. You know, and I was there with my own money. I think my income was technically below the poverty line that year. You know, and so just the huge difference in, like, the funding of these two sides, I think about all the time. So anyway, but so I think that's part of the reason is I think Care Court was built on this theory that what we need is more force, that people are refusing these abundantly available voluntary services, right? But there aren't abundantly available voluntary services, right? If you want to see a psychiatrist voluntarily and you're on Medicaid, like, the wait list, like, you have to wait months, right? Like, and so also, like, Alameda County, my own county, right, is under a settlement agreement with the Federal Department of Justice because we don't have enough community-based services. And so we've been trapping people in locked settings who, like, even their psychiatrists say they are ready to get out. And but like, we don't have any community-based, but not any, but we don't have nearly enough services outside of locked settings to get them out, right? So anyway, so I think this whole theory that like, oh, the state has enough community-based voluntary services that people would actually want, and people just are refusing them because, you know, they don't have insight, quote unquote, is largely not supported by evidence.
This is perfect. So they offer a set of lies. People refuse services because, you know, because they're just dysfunctional. That's a lie. People, when given their own resources, spend it on drugs. That's a lie. I actually remember once as a kid, you know, we were on welfare, and I remember another kid teasing me about it and saying, you know, my parents bought your shoes by paying, you know, the welfare. You use that welfare money to buy shoes. I remember thinking, like, what else is my mom gonna spend it on? Like, bought shoes for her kid. Um, and we've talked about this in past podcasts about the politics of resentment, which is the thing I want us to, you know, always be keying in on, is that they really try to exploit the politics of resentment. So even a kid teasing me about that is like, no, this is all of our money. All of us have worked and paid into this system, and our very existence creates revenue for this system. So don't get it twisted. But also, to your other point, they put forth lies to justify a policy. And then the policy says, we're going to take those most extreme cases that, you know, we've got families, there's some families who exist who feel like they have no control, that the severity of the mental illness that their loved one is suffering is causing them to be so impaired in their decision making that we need to force them into care. And the reality of that scenario differs greatly from how it's being presented. Then they say, okay, so we'll take these extreme cases, push them into a care-based setting, and then you'll see a lot less harm on the streets. This is a completely false premise that got codified into law. So if it's a false premise that gets codified into law, it's going to be hard to implement. Then you add to that the fact that, oh, there really aren't that many of those cases, are there? There are very few such cases where someone's that impaired. There are very few situations like that. Usually when you see someone who seems completely, you know, without cognitive function, or at least without kind of intellectual or reasonable function on the street, that's usually because of several failures by the state already, including the carceral system. If you surveyed folks dealing with mental illness on the street, have you been to jail? I'm going to say close to 100% will say yes. There's that. So already these failures are the reason for these so-called extreme situations. But then they realize, oh, there really aren't that many of these situations. And so now what do? Well, I guess we have to expand. And we expand because what we really want to do is warehouse people into carceral settings, because we feel like that's easier than creating housing, even though it's actually harder. But what is at the heart of the state? What is the intent? Now this becomes about intent. What do you actually want for people? Going back to politics of resentment. But then you say, okay, we want to warehouse people. Well, then we have to expand. And we saw what happened with SB 43. They said, well, now it'll include substance use disorder, a made up diagnosis. What is substance use disorder? If we're talking about addiction, that's a whole spectrum. That's a whole story. What do we mean? You know, they've started to say things like, you know, behavioral health issues. What does that mean? And now you bring us to Henry Stern's bill, which is going to include bipolar. So let's take a moment, because now we're establishing that these policies don't make any sense and they provide no answers. And in order to warehouse people and put them in settings, those settings have to be built. Those settings have not been built. So what we're learning is that the money's mainly going to judges, to consultants, and to nonprofits. And, you know, the grift that keeps on grifting. So there's that issue. So then let's talk quickly about bipolar. And I really am curious to hear your thoughts on this, Katie. I used to be a case manager. When I worked as a case manager, I was very young. And I would work with a psychiatrist sometimes. And I really struggled with how often they very casually diagnosed, and the population we were working with was mostly homeless folks, mostly unhoused folks. I came up through a program where they hired at-risk youth to work with at-risk youth. So I was a peer educator, then I was trained to be a case manager. So I was very fortunate to have those opportunities. And it was also very interesting for me to sit in on case conferences and begin learning how the system works. And I was always very uncomfortable with how often the psych professionals called someone bipolar. It felt
Mhm.
like a kind of Swiss Army knife diagnosis when we don't really know the situation, or we don't want to talk about poverty. We don't want to talk about their circumstances. We don't want to talk about the fact that having no money, not knowing where you're going to sleep is going to create a lot of volatility for anyone. There's no stress like, financial stress. And we're just going to call them bipolar. And that's how it felt. It felt very flippant. It felt very careless. It felt very casual. And I was also a teenager. And so, it was hard for me to know how to formulate my questions. I did ask a lot of questions. And last thing I say before I pass it to you is I would often ask the question like, well, what is it? What is this diagnosis? And I actually never got answers that felt satisfying. Mind you, I was also very young and still learning. So what do you think, of what is bipolar? I know you've studied some of the history of it, the diagnosis, and then B, rhetorically, but I want you to go as rhetorical as you want. How does one even fit that into such a policy?
So, I wanna be careful not to get out over my skis here because I'm not, I don't, I don't have like, I'm definitely certainly not a clinician who's like had to diagnose folks with bipolar. But I think, like one thing is most people, like I don't want to say most people, but like a lot of folks will start hallucinating after a fair amount of sleep deprivation, right? So, which like often is, can be considered one of the symptoms of mania in bipolar is hallucinations, right? So if you haven't been sleeping because you've been worried about your safety on the street, right? Like hallucinations are not that strange of an outcome, right? If there's any kind of substance use involved, like that can also, right, cause hallucinations and what have you. So I think like it's my understanding, and I say this with great humility as not a clinician, but it's very hard to diagnose someone on the street dealing with the pressures of the street, according to kind of the conventional psychiatric criteria without trying to tease out different influences. I also think this highlights one of the issues with making a diagnosis the eligibility criterion for a deprivation of civil liberties, right? Like that whole framework, like cannot exist, right? It's not okay for that to exist. And that's what the United Nations has said. That's what the World Health Organization has said. And then we in the US just ignore it. But it's not. And I think there's this weird duality among clinicians of like, they're just thinking, according to the, whatever criteria they learned in med school, to diagnose somebody that then have all these downstream effects on like what a person can do, right? Like if you have a bipolar diagnosis on your record, like number one, like you're going to experience more discrimination from clinicians in terms of any other medical issues you might have, because often you might, like if you show up to the VR, they see a bipolar diagnosis on the electronic health records, which are becoming increasingly universal. They might dismiss the rest of your complaints as due to the bipolar, and then they miss like a really important non-bipolar condition, and like you might get sicker or die as a result. Like we know that happens, right? And so kind of forgot where I was going with that, but yeah, so I think there are like all these kind of downstream consequences, and I think clinicians like to think like, oh, like we're just we're just applying the criteria that we learned in med school, and like not take responsibility for some of those downstream consequences, right? There are other jobs that you can't get if you have a bipolar you know diagnosis on your record, depending on like what the regulations are for that position, right? Or if you have an involuntary hospitalization on your record, like there are other jobs you can't get with that, right? And so that's something I think about all the time. And I very seldom hear mental health clinicians think about those kinds of issues when they're diagnosing people or putting people on involuntary holds or putting people in programs like Care Court, how that might like actually constrict that person's like future life opportunities, right? And so I think that gets into like imagining disabled futures, right? And that's kind of like a theoretical construct from disability studies, but like I think sometimes it's hard for non-disabled people to imagine the disabled people have a future, right? The disabled people might want a job in a certain industry, the disabled people might want to have kids, like, and so I think and like in terms of like who gets into the medical profession, right? We know from research that there's a lot of disability discrimination in medical training, and a lot of people with disabilities don't make it into MD doctor roles or clinician roles. And so you have this population of people who are much less disabled than the general population, who are then handing out these diagnoses when they've never experienced the consequence of such diagnoses. So I think and that's not to say like that that's true of all clinicians, like there absolutely are clinicians and psychiatrists who have their own mental health diagnoses, but I think about that a lot. Anyway, that's a lot of thoughts.
That's such a devastating point because again, the class analysis is so often intentionally avoided. And the main jobs that you can't get if you've had a mental health diagnosis or a hospitalization tend to be what we might call blue collar jobs, trade oriented jobs, a bus driver, a machine operator, many jobs that can become good union jobs where one can work with their family. Those types of jobs are often the ones where things like that can become a huge barrier. And you're so right when you say those things aren't even being considered, because like you said, these are policies being dreamed up between legislators, nonprofit advocates, and academics and clinicians.
Yeah.
And there's a lack of class consciousness that consistently rears its head, a lack of class analysis that consistently rears its head.
Yeah.
And then in the case of bipolar, which what you just said is very dangerous, is okay, so you keep expanding the qualifiers in order to take people's liberty away. And then bipolar itself can be essentially as expansive as you want it to be. I'm not saying there's no such thing as a bipolar diagnosis. I'm not saying that, but I am saying that just about anybody under duress can be diagnosed as bipolar. And like you said, the realities of living on the street, the realities of trauma, the realities of losing stability that you thought you had, trigger, expressions and presentations of stress that in a vacuum can be diagnosed as bipolar without a second thought. And again, this becomes very dangerous.
Yes.
It is very dangerous, especially, Henry Stern is in Los Angeles. The Olympics are coming to Los Angeles. They are looking for quick triggers with which to pull people into confinement. And make no mistake, conservatorship is presented as, oh, families need help from the state to get their loved one out of a dangerous situation who's not going to make the right decision. That's not how it's going to look. It's going to look like snatching people up off the street and placing them into confinement against their will, based on diagnoses that now include substance use disorder and bipolar. That is extremely alarming. And I think the two reasons we're not hearing more about it are that they know when put that way, a lot of people won't like it. And then B, it goes back to your point, Katie, which is that they're not infrastructuring it. So the only mitigating circumstance here is that they can't really do it very well right now. And so it goes back to there being kind of no there. So what do you think is the future of this policy right now under the current kind of political moment? And what do you, and I know there's so many more bills that we're obviously not going to get to. And we can do multiple segments of this. But what do you see as the future of this policy? What do you think are the implications of this policy? And what does it connect to other policies you think we should be on the lookout for?
I think that's a great question. One thing I think of, and this maybe is like getting a little back into the theoretical, but like, I think there's this danger, and the United Nations also points this out, where you make bills, like even in the original like Lanterman-Petra Short Act, which determines the criteria for conservatorship and did back in the 60s, right, when that bill came to pass, when that act came to pass, like I think there's this, like, sometimes there's this idea that like, oh, we need special protections for this population, right? Like we're going to pass these bills to protect the rights of people with psychosocial disabilities, with mental illness, what have you, right? And then what happens is that you can't get away from that marginalization, right? Like there's this idea like, okay, we're going to create this legal framework. Like, and I think there were some good intentions initially with the Lanterman-Petra Short Act of we're going to create this legal framework to protect the rights of people with psychosocial disabilities. And then other parts of the law like get developed, they're based on the marginalization. Like, oh, for example, and this is really controversial, but like if you've had if you've had like I don't remember the exact criteria, but like 5150s are very connected to gun rights, right? So like if you've had a certain number of 5150s, you no longer can like be licensed to own a firearm in California, which means you can't have like a whole classes of jobs are suddenly not possible for you because you can't carry a firearm, right? And so I think like so suddenly like these laws that are supposed to like protect the rights of folks, right, end up actually eroding civil liberties, right, and narrowing someone's life chances, because other people are then like, oh, we're gonna hook our bill to these to the, like, oh, like the housing conservatorship program that they tried in San Francisco that failed miserably, right? Like they were hooking that to history 5150s, right? As the eligibility criterion, right? Like care court is linked to history 5250, right? So I think that's why I think it's important not to like create these kind of categories in the law based on disability that then can be used to erode civil liberties of people with disabilities. Anyway, so on this bipolar addition to care court, I want to be really clear that like I don't think like it's better for a bill to only be targeted toward the most marginalized population, right? I think the issue is that adding bipolar expands the total N of people to whom this bill can apply. I don't think it's like okay if it's just people with schizophrenia spectrum or their psychotic disorders, because I think, again, I don't think it's okay for a bill, oh, if it just targets the most marginalized, then it's fine, right? Because like that's not fine. I think like we have to be there for everybody, right? We like everybody, full stop, right? And
That's right.
and so anyway, I don't know where this is gonna go. It has gotten more pushback in like the committee where it was heard, I believe it was health, Senate health, than the initial care court bill did. And it's also, they say it's not sponsored by the governor this time, so I think it might die in appropriations because it would also increase the expense of care court. I think also care court has gotten a lot of pushback because the enrollment has been the number of petitions and the number of care plans and agreements has been much lower than the governor initially expected, which like makes sense to me because their whole theory was wrong, right? So it makes sense that there aren't as many people eligible as the governor assumed would be. So I think in one way, I think this bill is a way to try to get that number of people, a number of petitions, number of care agreements and plans up, right? To make care court look more successful. I don't know what happens. I wish I wish I did.
Well, you made a really great point, and it's it's a great place for us to maybe kind of begin wrapping up on, which is that if you just try to make it the most marginalized, and let me preface by saying, even that's a dangerous phrase. Activist communities love to talk about the most marginalized, and it creates a hierarchy of value, and it creates a political laziness. So naming that is a phrase I don't really like anymore. But if you target what, so-called most extreme cases, and we don't step up and say, nope, you don't get to target them either. If we think it's okay to make exceptions, that incrementalism that becomes a snowball frankly, into fascism is what we're setting up. We've seen this happen, and this goes back to 94 crime bill, 96 immigration bill, welfare reform. Pretty much every policy that started as a claim to kind of shore up the extreme cases turned into all of us being targeted, and reminds us that there really is no such thing as the extreme cases. There are extreme moments, and those extreme moments are always products of prior failures. And I think your policy analysis really helps us understand that well. And it does, even though you said you're not sure where this is going, I feel like you did answer that question. It's going to them trying to, even with all this expansion, they can't expand it because it doesn't make sense. So now they're going to try to like forcefully expand it. So we're seeing a comedy of errors. And I think that if Trump wasn't president, because one thing that Trump does is he overwhelms the airwaves. He loves the press release. And so the media cycles get saturated and overwhelmed by one press release after another of him saying what he's going to do, some of which he does, some of which he doesn't. And I think that's part of why, with all the focus on his messiness, we're not hearing more about what a huge failure Care Court to SB 43 to Prop 1 to now these new bills. It's all been a complete failure. And in this case, we're glad it's a failure because it's kind of left people alone, but they've still gutted other really good, or at least semi-good
Right.
policies in order to fund it. So it creates
Right.
a lot of interesting openings. And part of why when you said, well, I'm not sure where this is going, you did answer where it's going is they're gonna keep trying, and they're going to keep tripping over their own feet on the way. They're going to keep kind of running into the walls that they build, acting like they didn't just build those walls. So it'll be this will be really important for us to continue to clock. I feel like nobody pays attention to this and analyzes this better than you.
I don't know about that.
I knew I knew you were going to say that. My opinion, guys. And then that'll allow us to continue to kind of, I think, broadcast to the public best that we can, because the media is going to fail on this for a number of reasons until we get better at getting them to do the right thing. We will continue to let folks know how this goes. And clearly, we only had time for a part one. So let's do a part two very soon, Katie. This is so enriching, really, and exciting to learn about what they're doing. And thank you so much for being so, so rigorous about it. And let's talk more soon, because I think some of the answers are coming and we can be in real time saying, well, here's what they're trying to do next.
Yeah, no, this has been a pleasure. It's so great to talk with you, Lex.
Great to talk with you. It's great to have you in this space. So yeah, this was the end of part one. Part two's coming. The only thing you'll notice different is that like our backgrounds or our jackets might be different. Mine probably won't. Okay, talk to you
I
soon.
probably won't either.
No,
And shout out to Carolina for organizing this silently behind the
yes,
scenes.
yeah. Shout out to the person behind the curtain, Carolina. Appreciate you. And more to come. Thank you.